So today we're going to finish up the brain. So last time we talked about the telencephalon. Remember, the telencephalon is part of the forebrain. And the telencephalon includes the cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex, the cerebral white matter, and the cerebral nuclei. Today we're going to start with the rest of the forebrain. So if you remember, the forebrain includes the telencephalon and the diencephalon. And so here's the diencephalon. Again, it's hollow in the middle. It's sort of a core of the brain, and so you can't see it from the surface. It includes three structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. If you take away the telencephalon, you can see this diencephalon. And it's the upper part of this picture. You can see that it's two bulging masses, sort of egg-shaped, and they bulge into the telencephalon. They surround the third ventricle. So here's a lateral view. The purple part up here, you can see these two bulging masses. If you do a sagittal section through the brain, it looks like this. And so if you look inside here, what you can see is something that sort of resembles a rooster's face. I mentioned this before, but this rooster's face, if you look at it, you can see an eye, you can see a beak, you can see sort of a white comb, you can see a neck, a crop, shoulder. Well, this rooster is a good way to orient yourself when looking at the brain. The rooster always looks toward the front. And so it's easy to tell anterior from posterior, superior from inferior by looking at this. Well, if you look at this picture, the blue part and the purple part are this diencephalon. Again, there are three structures here: the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. Let's look at the thalamus. The thalamus is a relay point for all of the sensory information that's ascending. Remember when we talked about the tracks going up? It looked like this. And we said that the dorsal columns and the spinothalamic tracts takes 3 neurons to get to where you're going. Well, if you look at this, you can find the first order, the second order, and the third order neurons. And what the third order neurons are located in the thalamus. So the synapses between second and third order neurons are located here. And the cell bodies of the third neurons are located here, and then they pass the information on up to the cortex. And so it's this sort of relay center for these third order neurons. That's not all it does, though. It doesn't just relay everything. It also edits the information and then bundles it up. And so if you think about a memory, or if you think about an experience, like I use here, the example pie. There's more to pie than what it looks like. There's smell, there's taste, there's appearance, maybe heat, maybe all kinds of things associated with a pie. Well, all of those things come from different organs. And so they get bundled together into a pie before sending it up to the cortex. Another thing the thalamus does is it helps to coordinate the activities of the cortex and the cerebral nuclei. So again, here's this rooster's face, and the turquoise part of it is the thalamus. So again, it's this relay center. But not only does it relay and bundle, it also edits the information. If we blow up the thalamus, you can see that it's a bunch of different nuclei. And there's a nucleus basically for every single sense that we have, except for odor. But they come here, they terminate here, and again, we're going to combine all these things. We're going to sort them out, we're going to edit it, and then we're going to bundle it and relay it as a group. But not everything that makes it to the thalamus makes it up to the cortex. If you think about the cortex as being the CEO of our brain, the guy in charge, well, if you compare that to the CEO of a corporation, like maybe Apple, if you think about the Apple, the company, the CEO is Tim Cook. Well, do you think that you could just walk into Tim Cook's office, or you could even just call him, or even possibly even just email him? Unless you had some very, very inside information, there would be no way to directly contact Tim Cook. You have to go through some sort of gatekeeper, some sort of executive secretary or something like that. Well, that's kind of the job of the thalamus. One of its jobs is to sort out, bundle up, and relay, but it does not relay everything that comes in. There's severe editing that goes on. So 99% of what makes it to the thalamus never makes it up to the cortex. It's discarded. So it'd be like all of the extraneous emails that came to Tim Cook, all the phone calls that were not very important, all of the mail that was kind of junk mail, all that stuff would get thrown away before it ever went into his office and in front of his eyes. And that's exactly the thing that the thalamus is good at doing. It prioritizes the information and sends it up for analysis. Another structure that you find in this diencephalon is the epithalamus. So in this picture, if you look right above the turquoise part, you'll see this orangey looking structure. That is the epithalamus. And the epithalamus really is not that interesting in terms of function. There's an area here that makes cerebrospinal fluid that's called a choroid plexus. But another thing that's here is there's a gland. It's an endocrine gland called the pineal gland. Pineal means pine cone shaped, and that's sort of what shape it has. It's an endocrine gland, and it makes a hormone. The hormone's called melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that helps us to set our sleep-waking cycles. The way it does that is melatonin is only secreted in darkness. So as the sun goes down, melatonin levels go up and you begin to feel sleepy. As the sun comes up, melatonin levels go down and you begin to feel more alert. Melatonin is also a way to tell what time of the year it is, what season it is, because the length of day is very different in June than it is in January. And so in June, there's a lot of light out. We spend a lot of time awake because there's very little melatonin. We exercise more, we eat less, we spend time outside, we do all sorts of things that we probably associate with things like spring and summer. But then winter comes along and the days get shorter, nighttime, darkness gets longer, and so melatonin levels go up. And when melatonin levels go up, we tend to sleep more, we tend to eat more, we tend to exercise less. In fact, we sort of almost, in a way, begin to hibernate. Melatonin can also affect mood. Some people have a really hard time living in places that don't have much sunlight. And so high melatonin levels can cause some people to become depressed. There's a condition associated with that. It's called SAD. SAD is an acronym for seasonal affective disorder. The third structure of this telencephalon is the hypothalamus. Hypo, remember, means below or beneath, and it's below the thalamus. And so in this picture, it's sort of the dark purple indigo colored thing. It looks like the beak of the rooster. Well, the hypothalamus is a really, really, really important part of the brain because the hypothalamus is part endocrine and part nervous. In other words, it's sort of the link between those two regulatory systems. And so it gets all kinds of information nervous-wise, but it also produces hormones, and it also controls other glands that produce hormones as well. If you look hanging down from the hypothalamus, you'll see the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then controls a bunch of other endocrine glands. And so the hypothalamus is the master of all of those endocrine glands. If you look at it, you can see it here in shaded form, and you can see the connection it has to the pituitary gland. Well, it also has a bunch of nuclei. If we blow it up, it looks like this, and you can see all these nuclei. Remember, nuclei are collections of neuron cell bodies inside the central nervous system. You can also see the pituitary gland and the little infundibulum that connects the two. So once again, the hypothalamus is in control of the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland then controls many other glands. It also has a lot of nervous system functions, and so it does things like regulating a bunch of things that are absolutely important for life. So we cannot live without blood pressure, so the hypothalamus helps to regulate that blood pressure. Our heart, even though it'll beat by itself, the hypothalamus helps to control how fast it's beating and how hard it's beating. It controls things like digestion, breathing. There are also centers here associated with a bunch of things like pleasure and fear and rage. If you were to put electrodes in these centers, you could produce these feelings in an individual. There's a pleasure center here, and if you put electrodes in the pleasure center and activate those, you flood the person with feelings of pleasure. You can do this with a rat. Put those electrodes in there, and then hook the electrodes to a bar and train the rat that if it presses the bar, it's going to get a little charge of this pleasure. And after a while, all the rat will do is sit there and press the bar over and over and over again. It will begin to ignore food. It will begin to ignore mates. It will begin to even ignore water until finally it just dies, because all it wants to do is push this little bar and get that feeling of pleasure. Now, you can't think of humans exactly the same way, but those pleasure centers can be activated by certain things like drugs. And if you think about what some people will do to get that feeling of pleasure, to get their next fix of drugs, you can get some idea of how important it is. There's also a center here associated with fear, and there's a center here associated with anger or rage. The hypothalamus also is where our body's thermostat is. It also is involved in sleep-waking cycles. It's also involved in our osmoregulation, or how salty our body fluids are. It also regulates feelings of hunger and satiation or satisfaction. So once again, if you were to do something with these centers, you could affect all those things. There are drugs that you can put in here and destroy the satiety center. If you destroy the satiety center, that means that the animal never ever becomes satiated. It never becomes full. And so it will eat and eat and eat and eat. And it will triple its body size. Don't forget, it controls the pituitary gland, which in turn is going to control all these other glands, the thyroid, the adrenal glands, the gonads. And then the hypothalamus produces two hormones of its own. One of those hormones is called ADH, and it has to do with fluid levels in the body. The other one is called oxytocin, and oxytocin has to do with things like labor and delivery, milk release from the breast, and it also has to do with things like bonding and trust. So that's the diencephalon. Again, that were the two parts of the forebrain, the telencephalon and diencephalon. Now we're at the midbrain, the mesencephalon. So if you look at the mesencephalon, remember this is the one that did not split. It didn't change very much. And we usually just call the mesencephalon the midbrain. And so when we look at it, that is really the only structure here. And most of what's in the midbrain are tracts. So if you look in this picture, you can see the midbrain. It's sort of the neck of the rooster. Running right through the center of the midbrain is the cerebral aqueduct, and it connects the ventricles. The third ventricle is found at the diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle is found between the met and myelencephalon. So this is a long tube that connects those two. The main structures of the mesencephalon are what are called the cerebral peduncles. So cerebral peduncles are just very large tracts. In fact, they're the pyramidal tracts. So when we talked about the tracts, remember these are descending tracts coming down from the cortex. They have those pyramidal cells in the cortex, and remember they control muscle movements, fine muscle movements. And so skilled motor movements. And so you need a lot of neurons in order to do that, because we need to control lots of different parcels individually. And so these tracts are very, very large. This is a lateral view, and you can see the cerebral peduncles here. They're these green streaky things next to the purple, next to the thalamus. And you can see just how big they are. There's one on each side. Another thing that the midbrain has is there are 4 centers that do reflexes. And when you look at them, they look like 4 bumps. They're on the posterior side of the midbrain, and you can see them here. Collectively, they're called the corpora quadrigemina. They're part of what's called the tectum. So if you remember the tectospinal tracts, that's where these are going to originate. Well, when you see them, there are 4 of these, 2 on each side. There's a superior and an inferior. Individually, they are called colliculi. So there is a superior colliculus on each side. That is where visual reflexes happen. So what do I mean by visual reflexes? Well, one thing has to do with a corneal reflex. If something approaches your eye or touches the cornea of your eye, we blink very quickly. Another thing is if you notice movement, in your peripheral vision and you don't know what it is, you instinctively look at it to see what it is. The same thing is true for the inferior colliculi, except this has to do with auditory. So unfamiliar sounds, we want to know what they are. We hear a sound, we move our head in a position to figure out where the sound is. So if you hear a bird singing in a tree, you turn your ears, you turn your head in such a way to pick up the sound, and so you can triangulate the position. And so again, we can see the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Let's look at the metencephalon. So the metencephalon is the hindbrain part of it. And if you look at the metencephalon, it's divided into 2 parts. The 2 parts that we find here are the pons and the cerebellum. So let's look at these 2 structures. Let's look at the pons first. Pons, that word means bridge. And what this is mostly is a bridge between the lower and upper brain. In other words, it's mostly tracts that run through here. So all of the ascending tracts run through here. All of the descending tracts run through here. You can see it here. It's sort of an egg-shaped mass on the anterior part. It's a sort of a green streaky thing with the streaks going horizontally. That's the pons. Let's look at the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. Remember, cerebrum means brain. Cerebellum means little brain. And it's about 10 or 11% of the entire brain mass. The cerebellum is all about muscles, skeletal muscles. It's all about contraction of skeletal muscles, patterns of contraction, timing of contraction. All of that happens in the cerebellum. And the cerebellum, since it's below the level of the cerebrum, the cortex, it's subconscious. So most of our muscle contractions that take place, we're just really not very aware of them at all. That doesn't mean you can't become aware, you can. But for 99% of the day, you don't think about muscles contracting at all. We just decide to do something and it seems like it just sort of happens. That's the cerebellum. It's also about timing and when to relax and when to contract. You can see it here in this picture. It's this green part, and you can see how big it is. It's very similar in a lot of ways to the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebrum had a cortex. The cerebellum has a cortex. Cerebrum had white matter. Cerebellum has white matter. Cerebrum had two hemispheres. So does the cerebellum. Cerebrum had lobes. So does the cerebellum. There are a lot of things that are very, very similar. You can see it here. It also has a wrinkled appearance. And those wrinkles, just like above, what they're there for is to increase the surface area. They're not called gyri and sulci, though. They're called folia. If you look at it from behind, you can see these two hemispheres. Two hemispheres are connected in the middle by something that sort of looks like an earthworm or some sort of caterpillar, and that's called the vermis. You can also see that there are three lobes on each hemisphere. Here they have them colored red, blue, and green. The red one here is called the anterior lobe. The green one is the posterior lobe. And there's a lobe in the middle, and that's called the flocculonodular lobe. I know it's a weird word, but what it really means is bumpy and fluffy. Another thing is, if you look inside it, you can see white matter. That white matter has sort of a very distinctive pattern that looks like a tree. And so it's called the Arborvitae. Arborvitae means tree of life. And like trees have leaves, the gray matter on the outside are the leaves of the tree. And another word for leaves is foliage. So these are called folia. So if we do a section through it, you can see it here. You can see this white matter in the very center, and you can see the gray matter on the outside. Remember, the cerebellum is all about skeletal muscle contraction. And so what happens is the cerebrum makes the decision to contract skeletal muscles. But it's the cerebellum that receives that information and figures out the best way to do it. So sort of a blueprint of the movement is created, and then it's sent back up to the cerebral cortex and then down to the muscles. So you can kind of think of the cerebellum as being the architect and the cerebral cortex as being the engineer when it comes to muscle contractions. Remember, we had somatotopy on the cerebral cortex. We also have somatotopy here. And remember, there was a little man, a homunculus. So we had a motor homunculus, which controlled all of the muscles of the body. Well, here is also another motor homunculus. And so you can kind of see it. Once again, the proportions are weird. The proportions have to do with how much muscle control, not the size of the body part. Well, in order for the cerebellum to be able to do what it needs to do, it needs a lot of information. And so there's a lot of tracts that go to the cerebellum. They're called peduncles. There are three pairs of these. So there are superior peduncles. The superior peduncles connect the midbrain to the cerebellum. There are middle cerebellar peduncles. They connect the pons to the cerebellum. And there are inferior cerebellar peduncles which connect the medulla, which we haven't talked about, to the cerebellum. So if you were to remove the cerebellum and look at it from behind, what's left are these peduncles. And you can see them here. There are 3 tracts. If you leave the cerebellum on, the tracts are not very visible. Let's look at the myelencephalon. So the myelencephalon is the most hind part of the brain. And remember, there's only one structure here. It's called the medulla oblongata. It's called medulla. Medulla means middle because it's sort of in the middle between the brain and the spinal cord. The top part of the myelencephalon looks more like the brain, and the bottom part looks more like the spinal cord. It's called oblongata because of its shape. It's oblong shape. So this is the most inferior part of the brain. And the tracts that we were talking about before also have to run through here. So the spinothalamic tracts, the dorsal columns, they run through here, but so do those pyramidal tracts. And the pyramidal tracts are very obvious because they're close to the surface. They form longitudinal ridges on the anterior side. This is also where the pyramids cross. So we get the decussation of the pyramidal tracts right here. So if we look at that, we can see these pyramids. So if you look down in the very center, the midline on each side is a ridge. Those are the pyramids. You can also see ridges more lateral. Another pair of things that we see here that are very obvious are called olives. So remember, it takes 3 neurons to go to where we're going if we're on the dorsal columns or the spinothalamics. Well, the second order neurons start here for the dorsal columns. And so when we look at them from the side, you can see the olive. Now, someone thought they look like olives. I don't know that they do, but they're on the lateral sides. Again, what we have here is the second order neurons. There is no editing here, the way that we had up in the thalamus. It just passes the information along. But because it's cell bodies, this is where gray matter is located. And cell bodies are larger than axons, and so we get this sort of swellings. And so again, those are the olives. Again, here's our spinothalamic and dorsal columns, and you can see right there where that happens in the medulla. There are also some centers in the medulla, some nuclei, and so just like we had some control up in the hypothalamus, there's also control here. The control that happens here, you can divide it up into 2 parts. It's either what's called vital or non-vital. Vital means you can't live without it. And so there are vital centers here. One of these is there's cardiovascular center, which controls or helps to control the heart. Another one is the respiratory centers. There's 2 of these in here that control the rate and depth of breathing. And then finally, we have also non-vital centers for things like hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, and so on. Those are all found here. So that concludes the brain.